Hello, welcome back. Happy New Year, everyone. I'm really excited about all of our future episodes this year, and I'm looking forward to getting to know more of you as we continue our journey through the Labour Party's history. In today's episode, we'll look at how the First World War led to the creation of the WNC, strengthened the influence of trade unions, and led to a devastating split in the Liberal Party. All that and more on this episode of the History of the Labour Party. By the 3rd of August 1914, the First World War was well underway. The triggering of defensive alliances and counter-alliances resulted in most major powers in Europe now finding themselves involved in some way. On the 4th of August, Belgium rejected a German ultimatum. The ultimatum had demanded free passage through the country. This would have allowed German forces to attack France from a direction in which they had few defences. Following the rejection, Germany declared war on Belgium, triggering the 1839 Treaty of London. As a consequence, Britain declared war on Germany, and so Britain entered the First World War. Whilst the First World War is an incredibly fascinating period of history, and one which changed almost every aspect of Britain, we'll be focusing on how the Great War affected the Labour Party and the Labour movement. One of the first consequences of the First World War on the Labour Party was the resignation of Ramsay MacDonald from the party chairmanship. As an opponent of Britain's entry into the war, MacDonald found his position untenable when the party he led voted to support the government's request for war credits. But whilst MacDonald's position on World War I would be important later in his political career, there were other more impactful events happening alongside his resignation. The formation of the War Emergency Workers' National Committee, which from now on I'll just refer to as the WNC, was a milestone moment in the history of the Labour movement. The WNC was set up to ensure that Labour, that's Labour with a small l, as in workers, spoke with one unified voice. This rare display of unity shown by the Labour movement would ensure that their concerns were heard, acted upon, and that they remained relevant throughout the war years. The body encompassed the wide, diverse range of different actors within the movement. The TUC, the General Federation of Trade, the Parliamentary Labour Party, women's rights groups, you name it, it was there. Whilst the makeup of the WNC was diverse, so too were the responsibilities and activities that the body undertook during the war. Of course, one of the main responsibilities of the WNC was to call out practices and events which hurt workers. This ranged from fighting against tax evasion to highlighting shortcomings in the awarding and completion of government contracts. That sounds familiar. Listening to this podcast during the coronavirus pandemic, or in its aftermath, that will really help you to picture the situation that the government, workers, and the WNC faced. A sudden scramble to adjust to a drastically different reality led to the abandonment of normal checks and procedures. In today's crisis, we see tens of millions being spent on unusable PPE. In 1914, the WNC was highlighting army boots with poor and insufficient lining, and timber merchants increasing their prices upon hearing that the army planned to house troops in wooden huts. On employment, the WNC protested and were triumphant in preventing locally stationed soldiers being used to undercut local workers, for example, such as farmers. The body also lobbied to improve the rights and working conditions of the Women's Land Army. Food supply and food prices were two of the main issues that really affected the day-to-day lives of people in Britain at the time, and they were two issues that the WNC campaigned heavily on. The WNC passed resolutions calling for food control, a strategy for home-growing produce, and the abandonment of government plans to sterilise and sell meat infected with tuberculosis. Of course, all of this produced favourable headlines for the Labour Party and the WNC, slowly building up their favour and reputation amongst the general public, but particularly amongst workers. The WNC campaigned to stop the use of children under 13 being used as farm workers. They tried to halt the eviction of renters who had fallen behind on payments, and they called for an end of the surveillance of soldiers' and sailors' wives whose husbands were overseas. Now, that last point, I didn't actually know that ever happened until I was researching this episode of the podcast. And I found it really shocking how far we've come. With every success, with every person who was helped, the popularity of the left grew. After all, good deeds are not easily forgotten. David Swift puts it nicely when he describes the WNC as a lobbying organisation and a friend in high places to those most in need of one. Arguably, the most important role the WNC had was as an umbrella movement which maintained the labour movement's cohesion. Because of this, after the war, the Labour Party and the trade union leaders would have much closer links with the cooperatives, female right groups, and a whole host of others. The activities undertaken by the WNC were crucial in its campaign to persuade the British public of the real need for a strong British left. All of these actions, campaigns, and communication with government departments by the WNC brought trade unions into the heart of government, a position they had never previously had afforded to them. This presence would only grow when Henry Asquith invited Labour to join his coalition government in April 1915. As a result of this, Arthur Henderson, who had taken over as leader after MacDonald's resignation, became the first Labour MP to hold a cabinet position when he was appointed as the President of the Board of Education. For the first time ever, trade unions had a voice in cabinet, and Henderson made sure that it was a voice which was heard. During the 4 years the war raged, between 1914 to 1918, there were other actions which would help Labour's fortunes. Amongst the most important of these was the devastating split which emerged within the Liberal Party, a split so big that it eventually led to the resignation of Henry Asquith. We spoke in the last episode about Asquith's government passing the so-called People's Budget and introducing unprecedented taxes on land ownership and on the wealthy. With this action, Asquith earned himself many Conservative critics. So, when the opportunity to depose him arose, they jumped on it. However, that opportunity only appeared because of a brutal political coup d'etat by David Lloyd George. David Lloyd George at the time was the War Secretary. Backed by the Conservatives, he claimed that he no longer believed Asquith could win the World War. He demanded that the embattled PM hand over control of military operations to a war cabinet. Unable to accept this, Asquith dissolved his government. Lloyd George would then form a new coalition government with the Conservatives. But such a takeover exaggerated already existing divisions within the party. The Liberal Party would suffer from particularly bad infighting over the upcoming years between those who had supported Lloyd George's premiership and those who still supported Asquith. As the famous saying goes, divided parties don't win elections. And the clear splits in the Liberal Party would definitely help Labour in the 1918 election. And that's where we leave it for this week. Join me next week as we examine how the Labour Party reformed itself after the conclusion of the First World War, the 1918 general election, its implications, and so much more. As always, if you enjoyed this episode, then please do share and get in touch, either on Twitter at History of Labour, or send us an email at historyofthelabourparty@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next week.